Hey everybody, hope you're having a good week and just thankful that you're joining in today for this midweek Bible study. And it sure is getting old preaching to a camera. I'm ready to see your faces again when I preach, and ready to have your comments like we normally do on our Wednesday night classes. But I know that we need to endure just a little bit longer to keep everybody safe, and just thankful that so far we've had very little in our own community, and hopefully we can keep it that way, and praying that it stays that way. Hope you all are safe and feeling well, and if you need anything, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me or one of the elders. We hope you know we're still here for you in whatever way you need us. And so just hang in there, and pretty soon, hopefully, we're going to start weaning ourselves back to our normal routine. We will be having our Dose of Encouragement devotional again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and would encourage you to join in on Facebook Live if you're able to. And if you have any prayer requests, please be sure to let me know about those, and we'll be sure to include that in our prayer on Thursday. We will be live streaming our service again this Sunday on YouTube Live at 10 a.m. And so if you have any trouble logging on or viewing that, just let me know. Be sure to help with that in whatever way we can. Tonight we're going back to the book of Philippians in our study, and our thoughts tonight are on a new way of thinking. And let me just start off by asking a question. How often do you really think about what you think? That might sound like a strange question, but it can be one of the most powerful questions for us to ask ourselves. Most of our thoughts come and go on autopilot. We don't think about them very much. You know, something happens, we react to it, and that's it. It's over with. We move on. Maybe we don't have time, really, to just stop and think about how we think about things. But everything that we experience gets passed through the filter of our thoughts. And even though we may not always realize it, we are constantly thinking, constantly evaluating, constantly interpreting what is happening to us in life. And it's good, it's bad, it gets passed through this filter that evaluates everything that happens. And the reason that's important is because it has such an effect on lots of other aspects of our lives. Now, at times we may feel that a lot of this is out of our control. We just think the way we think, and that's the way we've always thought. That's the way we're always going to think, and that's just the way it is. But the Bible actually tells us otherwise. We cannot control the things that happen to us in the world, but we can choose how we're going to think about them. And that being said, it can be an advantage to us to think about ourselves as an air traffic controller in our own mental airport. Thoughts are circling around and wanting to land, but we ultimately get to decide which ones get to land and which ones have to leave. And particularly when those thoughts that are swirling around are fearful, anxious, negative, pessimistic thoughts that are wanting to take hold and take over the way we feel, the way we act, the way we experience what's happening to us in life, we get to decide. We may not have control over what's circling around, but we do have control over what gets to land and what gets to take hold and what gets to influence the way we feel and the way we act. Now, I know it's nearly impossible to not think about something. if I were to say to you right now, I don't want you to think about a pink elephant. Now, don't do it. I don't want you to. Don't think about a pink elephant. The more I say that, the more you're going to think about a pink elephant. And like last week we said, don't worry. I know in reality, the more you try to tell yourself don't worry about something, generally, the more you're going to worry about it. When you have trouble sleeping, the more you try to tell yourself to go to sleep, the more difficulty you have going to sleep. I know that it's nearly impossible to just say to yourself, don't think about that, and you won't think about it. But what we do have the power to do is when we have thoughts arising that are not pure, or that are not trusting, or that are fearful and anxious in nature, we have the power to redirect our thoughts to something that is pure and something that is positive. And that's what this lesson is all about. It's about, number one, becoming more aware of the way we think about things. And becoming more aware to try to identify the thoughts that may be defeating to us, that may be a hindrance to us, so that we can redirect those thoughts to thinking that is positive and that is powerful in nature. That's what our lesson is about today. And again, we go back to the book of Philippians. And we see a book where Paul writes things like, rejoice in the Lord always. Now, what he is writing there in that verse is a reflection of what he was thinking. And we marvel that this is what Paul is thinking about while he's sitting in a Roman prison. When life has been so unfair and life has been so painful and so difficult for him, yet he is sitting there thinking about how he rejoices in the Lord always. And we want to understand, how is that possible? I don't know if that was Paul's first thought. His first thought might have been to complain about his circumstances. But what his final thought was, the thought that he redirected himself to, and the thought that he chose to allow to take hold, is this thought: rejoice in the Lord always. Someone has said, your problem is not your problem. Your problem is how you see your problem. I think there is a great deal of truth to that statement. Your problem is not your problem. Your problem is how you see your problem. I'm not saying that you don't have problems. COVID-19 is a problem. Sickness is a problem. Poverty is a problem. Death is a problem. Persecution is a problem. I'm not saying that there aren't real problems in the world. But often enough, the problem that causes us the most trouble is not the problem itself, but the way we see the problem. So tonight, let's focus on how our thoughts are related to our fears and our sorrows. And let's talk about developing a way of thinking that will help us deal with sadness, with frustration, with fear, and ultimately with depression. There's 2 points that I want us to consider tonight. One, you can pick what you ponder. You do have power over what you think and how you interpret your life, okay? How you interpret God, and that you can see that properly according to Scripture. So you can pick what you ponder. That's what I hope we can approach this week knowing. Number 2, you can affect the way you feel. By concentrating on the way you're thinking, you can affect the way you feel about things. And the way we feel about things has so much power over ultimately what we choose to say, what we choose to do, how we choose to treat people, how we approach life. So, if we want to approach life in a better way, we want to affect the way we feel about life. And if we want to affect the way we feel about life, we need to pick the way we're going to ponder about life. All right, so first of all, we notice that the thoughts of a person's mind will determine the peace in a person's heart. It's impossible for us to harbor negativity in our minds and feel safe and secure in our hearts. Bad thinking leads to bad feelings, and the heart and the mind are pulled apart in the process of that. Now, one thing that I personally do not spend a lot of time doing is trying to trace down the origin of these thoughts. And that's a natural question that people want to know is, well, why do I have these bad thoughts? Why do these negative thoughts come up in my mind? Why do I have these anxious thoughts, it seems like? Why is my first instinct to be fearful of a situation? I don't know. And any effort that I have made to try to trace that out and pinpoint that just hasn't seemed to really come up with anything fruitful. Now, truly, there are factors involved, and it could have to do with genetics and the way that we're born, because genetics affect the way our brains operate. It could have a lot to do with our experiences, and surely it must. If we've experienced trauma, obviously that's going to be a factor in how we process things, how we process the world that we live in. So truly, all of these things in the past do have a powerful effect on the way we think about things and the way we interpret things. But I just have never been able to have much success in pinpointing that I think this way because this happened to me. I believe that it is much more powerful to focus on the present, to focus on what's happening now, and to try to influence what is happening now. What am I thinking now? And how is it affecting what I'm doing now? Proverbs 4:23 says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life." We are what we think. That's what that passage is telling us. So if we want to change the person that we are, the area of our focus needs to be on changing the way we think about things. See, I can't change the experiences I've had in the past, good or bad. I can't rewrite them. I can't rewind and undo them. They are what they are. I can't change that. And I could spend a lot of time focusing on those things that have happened in the past, but the reality is the present is just going to stay the same as long as I do that. All I really have any power over is what I'm thinking now and what I'm doing now, and whether or not I'm allowing the past to continue to control the person that I am now. Proverbs 23:7 says, "For as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you." As he thinks in his heart, so is he. The thoughts of a person's mind will determine the peace in a person's heart. So that's where we put our focus, on a new way of thinking. And Paul emphasizes this in the book of Philippians. In Philippians 4:8, he says, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." In that same context where he has said, rejoice in the Lord always, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer, where he also says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In this passage that has so much about finding joy even in unpleasant circumstances, right here is the centerpiece of all of that. It tells us to be more aware of what you meditate on. and to make a choice to meditate on things that are true, noble, just, pure, lovely, and of good report. Things that are of virtue and praiseworthy. Think on things that are true, real, honest, fair. Because fear is such a liar. An exaggeration is the fuel that fuels the fire of fear. Think on things that are noble. Fear feeds on thoughts that are cruel and harsh and hateful. We need to replace those thoughts with thoughts of mercy and grace, both toward ourselves and toward others. Think on things that are just, fair and right in the sight of God and man. Think on things that are pure, decent, and wholesome. Think on things that are lovely, that are pleasing, agreeable, and kind. Think on things that are of good report, that are worthy of respect. And think on things that are virtuous, that are of good character, and things that are praiseworthy. Each one of these words is a key that unlocks the door toward this mindset that we see in Paul in the book of Philippians, where he is able to rejoice in the Lord even while he's sitting in a Roman prison. And so that we can rejoice in the Lord even when we're in the midst of a historic pandemic. We can rejoice in the Lord even when we go through trials and temptations. This passage is the key that unlocks that door. Think about what you think. Ponder how you interpret things, and pick the way you ponder. As you do that, you can affect what you feel. Now, here's what the rest of this lesson is. Much of my life, I have dealt with prevalent anxiety and at times bouts with depression. Generally, I've done a pretty good job about keeping that hidden. I guess I had this, the way I pondered that part of me was that in my mind I thought only weak people have problems with things like this. And so because of that, I always felt like I needed to keep that hidden. There was something wrong with me. There's something wrong in my faith that I was dealing with these problems. I was much like the psalmist in Psalm 42:5, where he says, "Why are you cast down, O my soul?" I asked myself that question many times. And should have been much more honest with myself and much more honest with others about the battle that I was fighting in myself. Because the reality is, there is no temptation that is unique, but such as is common to man, 1 Corinthians 10 says. And I realize now that the fight that I was fighting is a fight that so many other people, so many other Christians fight on a regular basis. So what we have in the rest of this lesson are things that I have come across that have been helpful to me, and things that I use in the process of doing counseling and trying to help others. And all of the counseling I do is from a spiritual starting point. I'm always thinking of it in biblical and spiritual terms. And for me, fighting this fight or dealing with this issue and managing the situation is about being more aware of the way I'm thinking about things. If I'm more aware of how I'm thinking about my life, then I'm more aware of affecting how I feel about things. We just cannot separate the link between what we think and what we feel. And when a person is down, there's usually a problem in the way they're thinking about that situation. I think of it with this formula: A plus B equals C. And in that formula, A represents an actual event, something that happens, whether that's something good or something bad. And B represents what I believe about that event. And C represents a consequence, whether it be an emotion that I feel or an action that I choose. And what this formula represents to me, that it's not just the event, it's not just A that produces these emotions and these actions represented by C, but it's A plus my belief about it. Okay? Let me give you a biblical example. To me, the best way to illustrate this is the story of the 12 spies that were sent into Israel, Numbers 13 and 14. Now, what actually happened is that 12 spies spent 40 days in the land of Israel, where they saw cities surrounded by massive walls and protected by giant soldiers. Okay? The end result, the C in this case, was that the Israelites as a nation were filled with fear and overcome by their anxiety. And overcome by that emotion, they chose to not obey God's commands to go up and fight for the cities. Instead, they wanted to return to Egypt, from which God had rescued them. Now, what happened was there was a belief, okay, on the hands on the side of 10 spies who went into the land, and by those 10 spies, the rest of the nation of people, there was this belief: we can't overcome these soldiers. We can't penetrate these walls. We will die if we try to go up and fight against these cities. Our children will die, and we will be grasshoppers in their sight. So out of that belief, they decided they needed to turn around and go back. That was the negative, pessimistic belief that ultimately determined what they chose to do. On the other side was Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua and Caleb said, we can penetrate those walls. We can defeat those giants because God has promised to be with us and help us. We can deal with this problem because God is going to make sure that we can. And because of that belief, they chose that they wanted to go up and fight. And they did. They had to wait for the 40 years of wandering to be finished. But eventually, Joshua and Caleb led a new generation of people to go in and possess the promised land and live there. Now, the actual event was the same for Joshua and Caleb as it was for the other 10 spies. They saw the same cities, the same walls, the same soldiers. So the difference is not A, the difference is B, what they believed about it. The reason I make this point is that so often when we're going through a tough time and our lives are filled with a lot of fear and a lot of sadness and sorrow, and we think that it's only A that is causing us to have this situation. We have this problem, and it's because of this problem that we are not able to overcome, that we're not able to manage and deal with this situation. But often enough, it's not just the problem, but it's also what we believe about the problem. And that's what I mean when I say your problem is not your problem, but it's the way you see it. So there are some self-defeating thoughts that are very commonly at work in those times when we are most fearful and most overcome by our anxiety. And so what I want to do in the rest of this lesson, if we have time and if we don't have enough time, we may come back to this again and talk about this some more in another lesson. But what I want to do is just talk about some of the most common negative, pessimistic thoughts that are at work when we are at our lowest points in life. And if we can begin to identify these self-defeating thoughts, then we can begin to ponder or pick what we ponder and choose a more positive approach. And by picking what we ponder, we can affect what we feel and have a better outcome. All right, so here's number one. We want to avoid the tendency to be our own worst critic. Sometimes we're not even really aware that we're doing this. We don't really stop and think about it. But when we do, we realize that it's very easy for us at times to develop a mindset that finds fault with practically everything we do. I don't know why we do this to ourselves, but it's very easy to develop a mindset where nothing is ever good enough. Nothing we do is ever really as good as it should be. Now, it's true we're not perfect. We're not ever going to be perfect. But have we done the best that we can? And if we have, we should be able to offer ourselves the same mercy that we offer to others. When we see others that have tried as hard as they can in a situation, we say, you should be proud of what you've done. You should take comfort in knowing that you gave it everything that you have. Now that's the encouragement that we give to others, and we should allow ourselves to give ourselves that same mercy. Matthew 7:1 says, "Judge not that you be not judged," which means more specifically, don't judge in a harsh way. Don't judge in an unfair way. Don't judge just based on appearances, but judge with mercy and judge with grace. And if that's the way we're supposed to treat others, we can treat ourselves the same way. If we are to forgive others and show mercy, then we are allowed to forgive ourselves if we tried to make things right and be merciful to ourselves. We can offer ourselves the same edification that we offer to others. Because if we constantly tell ourselves, you can't do anything right, then we probably will never really try the way that we could. If a person, let's say a student is approaching an exam, and leading up to the exam, they just keep telling themselves, I can't do anything right. I'm probably going to fail this exam. I'm just not a good student. The whole time they should be studying, they're distracted by these thoughts of this nature. And they may do poorly on the test, not so much because they can't, but because they've been distracted. And so if they do poorly, then those self-defeating thoughts become self-fulfilling prophecies. And that same process plays out at school, at work. I can't do anything right. I'll never do anything right. It plays out in dating. I never meet anyone. I'm not good enough to meet anyone and have a happy life. It plays out in marriage. I'll never be a good enough husband. I'll never be a good enough wife. It plays out in parenting. Nothing I do is right in parenting. I always should do better than what I'm doing. What I'm doing as a parent is never good enough. There is a place to evaluate ourselves, correct areas that we need to correct and do better. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that if our thoughts generally center around being our own worst critic, We'll probably find that those are thoughts that are going to defeat us instead of compelling us to really be the best that we can be. Well, I believe that's something that we need to identify and to try to redirect. We are allowed to remember that we are human. And while we want to be our best, we understand that as humans we'll not be perfect. Psalm 103 verses 13 and 14 says, "As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. For he knows our frame, and he remembers that we are dust." God remembers that we're human. And as such, he is merciful and gracious toward us. And certainly we should be able to give ourselves that same act of mercy. We want to avoid the belief that one mistake, or one sin even, means that we are and always will be a failure in all aspects of our lives. Judas doomed himself as hopeless unnecessarily because he decided that this one sin was going to result in being a failure for the rest of his life. And he had nothing to live for. But that just wasn't true. The Lord would have still been his friend. The Lord would have still forgiven him and restored him. But that belief is what kept him from ever realizing that. We want to understand that there is a difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is something we feel over one mistake that we made, and we wish that we had not made that mistake, and we want to make it right. That's healthy. That compels us to grow. But shame is where we take that guilt and we inflate it to this broad construct about who we are as a person. By this one mistake, I am a failure. I am worthless. I am my life is pointless. My life is worthless. See how shame takes guilt and like a balloon blows it up until it becomes much larger than it was ever meant to be. And what we need is God's grace and peace to deal with both guilt and shame. Shame has no place whatsoever. Guilt can have a healthy place in helping us to grow. But thankfully, we have God's grace that can give us peace from both our guilt and our shame. Philippians 1:2. And there are times when we just need to allow ourselves to remember that we're human. Here's something else that can be a problem. We want to avoid attaching our worth to achievements or the opinions of others. If we allow ourselves to enter into that mindset that says, I have to always succeed to show that my life is worth something, or I have to be liked by others, I have to be appreciated by others, I have to be applauded by others in order to know that my life has value, then we can send ourselves down a very dark and discouraging alley if we allow ourselves to live that way. Instead, it's much healthier to find our worth in our relationship with God. Our lives have worth because we are made by God, we are loved by God, we have been saved by God. We were made to glorify God, 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. And we should avoid the lie that ever says that our lives have no meaning, they have no value. Because they do. God has invested that value in us. So, while we should strive to do our best and we always want to see what we can accomplish for the Lord's glory, we should avoid attaching our worth only to our achievements or to the opinion of others. Here's another potential problem that we might face in our thinking. We want to avoid taking blame for crimes that we do not commit. People that deal with anxiety and depression, as a general rule, have a tendency to blame themselves for things that really shouldn't blame themselves for. Someone is unhappy. Well, that's their fault. If they were a better husband, if they were a better wife, if they were a better son, if they were a better daughter, these people wouldn't be unhappy. We especially experience this when we're dealing with grief. One of a typical phase that we deal with when we've lost someone we love is what's called bargaining. And bargaining is a mindset where we go through this mental process. If I had been taking better care of them, this wouldn't have happened. If I'd been more watchful, we would have seen this earlier. If I had somehow been a better person, then they would still be here with me. Which is a natural thing for a lot of us to do, but it's not fair, is it? Basically, we are forcing ourselves to be God. I have to know everything. I have to handle everything perfectly. And because I didn't, this tragedy struck. That's what Job's friends tried to do to him. Job had tried so hard to live a good life, and he did. He was a good man. But his friends came along and said, Job, you must have done something bad, because all of this tragedy wouldn't have come into your life unless you had done something terrible. Now, what was it now? Go ahead and tell us what it was. Now, the truth is, a lot of us do that same thing to ourselves. We lose someone, or something bad that's beyond our control happens, and we look at ourselves and we think, if I had been a better person, this wouldn't have happened. Sometimes in divorce, there's no such thing as a perfect husband or a perfect wife. Sometimes even when you've tried everything you can do to be the spouse that you're supposed to be, someone will commit adultery. Someone will turn away. Someone will leave you behind. And we often look at ourselves and we think, if I had been more perfect, and I could have prevented this. Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes we just make the mistake of blaming ourselves for crimes that we didn't commit. Because of that way of thinking, we cause ourselves a great deal of distress. This is a big one. We want to avoid telling ourselves that the demands of life are impossible to manage. This is what the Israelites did. It's not that we don't have a problem. Sometimes things are bad. But we don't want to make them worse by telling ourselves that it's the worst thing ever. It's so bad that it's impossible for me to deal with. Well, that's not true. Because when God is with us, He will not allow us to be tempted above what we are able. He will provide for us the power and the strength that we need to deal with things. This is what Paul was saying in Philippians 4:13 when he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So we're not saying that things aren't bad and that things aren't painful, but let's don't magnify or exaggerate them by saying that we can't handle it, we can't manage it. Henry Ford has been quoted as saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Because if you think you can, you probably will. And if you think you can't, you probably won't. I know this is a lot easier said than done, trust me. And there are a lot of days when I don't practice very well what I'm preaching. It's a constant effort. It's a lifelong process of trying day by day to choose the thoughts that will help me to keep my chin up, to keep my heart stout, to keep my faith moving and going forward, and to keep trusting that God will see us through. It would be nice if you could tell yourself one time, I can do this through Christ who strengthens me. You just tell yourself that one time and be done with it. But it really doesn't happen that way. Those who finish their course faithfully are those who keep telling themselves that day after day after day after day, I can do this through Christ who will strengthen me. Along with that, we want to avoid a pessimistic expectation for the future. Sometimes we assume things will be bad before they really are. We assume that things will be traumatic even before they are. And that causes us a great deal of distress. And we exaggerate and turn those molehills into mountains. In 1 Kings 19, we see a situation where Elijah did this to himself. I'm not saying his situation wasn't bad. He was rejected by Ahab and Jezebel. They wanted to kill him, and he was afraid. He was stressed with the pressure of his ministry. He was frustrated and exhausted. He was lonely, and he felt helpless. And he said, God, take my life. I don't want to have to deal with this anymore. But one of the problems that Elijah brought upon himself was that he exaggerated things. For example, he said, I alone am left. There's no one else serving you, God, but me. Well, that really wasn't true, and God showed him that there were 400. There were many more that, not 400, but there were many more who had not yet bowed the knee. There were many who were still faithful. God was still with him in those quiet moments, and God urged Elijah to just take care of himself physically. Sleep. Here's something to eat. Here's some water to drink. Now, rest. And if we listen through the ear of faith, I think God would say the same to us. Here's what I want you to do. Make sure you get a good night's sleep. Try to eat well. Try to exercise. Keep connecting with me in prayer and Bible study and worship. Keep trying to redirect those negative thoughts into positive ways. Take care of yourself. It's okay to do that. I believe it's one of the ways that Paul was able to maintain such a positive expectation for the future, as he did in so many different places. Well, basically everything that I've said so far is summed up in this last point, which is to avoid the tendency to dwell on the negative and filter out the positive. The Israelites did this time after time in the wilderness. Every time they would encounter a problem, they would forget everything that God did for them. We have a tendency to count our problems and ignore our blessings. We need to count our blessings and ask for God's help with our problems. And anytime something arises in the present, look back and see how God has brought you through things before. And trust that He's going to bring you through this too. He's going to bring you through this problem in front of you now. Sometimes what it takes is just a new way of thinking. A new way of thinking. Kristen Taylor was facing a prison very different from Paul's, but she approached it with the same thoughts as he did. Her daughter, Rebecca, had a genetic condition, and this resulted in 55 surgeries and about 1,000 days in the hospital. She blogged about her experience and made the following post that I'm going to mention after her daughter had suffered a hemorrhagic stroke. She said, this past week's new landmine is the phrase, possible hemorrhagic stroke. A phrase I heard dozens of times, used by numerous physicians. Over and over and over, the phrase filled my mind and consumed my thoughts. It was emotionally crippling. This past Sunday, our preacher started a very fitting series on anxiety. We reviewed the familiar Philippians 4:6 verse, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication. I presented my request to the Lord as I had so many times before, but this time I needed more. And so, using Philippians 4:8 and 9 as a guide, I found my answer. Finally, brothers, whatever is true. What is true in my life at this particular moment? One thing is the blessing of all my family members eating dinner together. What is noble? The blessing of enjoying each other's presence outside of a hospital room. What is right? The blessing of experiencing my two sons' lives daily. What is pure? The blessing of all three children laughing and playing with each other. What is lovely? The blessing of watching Rebecca sleep peacefully in her bed at night. What is admirable? The blessing of an honorable team working tirelessly on Rebecca's care. What is praiseworthy? The blessing of worshiping a Lord who is worthy to be praised. Think about such things. And that's what I did. As I meditated on these things, I stopped the dreaded phrase, hemorrhagic stroke, from sucking any joy out of my life. Its power to produce anxiety was now rendered impotent. And when I dwelt on the bountiful blessings in my life happening at this very moment, the peace of God, which transcends all understandings, did guard my heart and my mind in Christ Jesus. She closed her post by saying, "Thank you, Lord." Let's all strive this week. I know it's easier said than done, but we can do it, to bring our thoughts into captivity for the glory of Christ. And as we strive for this new way of thinking that we see here in the book of Philippians, I know the grace and mercy of God will bring peace to our hearts, a peace that transcends all understanding. Let's bow together for a word of prayer. Lord, my prayer today is very simple. I ask you, Lord, to help us meditate on those things that will bring peace into our lives. Help us, Father, to trust in your grace and your mercy. Help us to trust in your love, your wisdom, and your power, that in whatever situation we may be facing, we can know that we are safe and secure in your care and keeping. When these negative thoughts are circling around and wanting to enter into our lives, give us the strength and the courage that we need to resist them, to redirect our thoughts toward those things that are positive and encouraging. Help us, Father, to have the stamina to continue this effort day after day. I pray for all of our families, Lord, that are watching this video. And I know, Father, that as you know our needs individually, that you will help us and bless us in ways that only you can. Help us to put our trust in that reality today and every day. Please forgive us of our sins and strengthen us, Father, to be the people that you would have us to be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I'm so glad that everyone joined in for this study, and I hope and pray that in some way it's blessed you and will help you deal with the things that you're dealing with. We look forward to being together on Sunday to worship the Lord. Till then, God bless. Love you all.